In the not-too-distant future, the next generation will be running our institutions, corporations, and governments. Will they have the skills needed to operate in a constantly changing environment? Let's find out. Joining us now in Boston, Massachusetts via Skype, Tony Wagner, Innovation Education Fellow at the Technology and Entrepreneurship Center at Harvard University. He's also author of Creating Innovators, the Making of Young People That Will Change the World. You can read more about him as well at TonyWagner.com on his website. Tony, it's good to have you on the line there from Boston. I just wonder if we could start by having you tell us, what is it about the times that we're in right now that makes you emphasize the importance of innovation in terms of being ready for the next generation and what is still to come?
Well, that's just the right question, Steve. The world is changing so quickly, especially the world of work. Increasingly, any job that can be turned into a routine, white-collar jobs, manufacturing jobs, those kinds of jobs are being very rapidly either offshored or automated. So if you want to have some kind of job security in the future, you're going to have a set of skills that enables you to be a creative problem solver, that enables you to sort of bring initiative and an entrepreneurial spirit to whatever it is you're doing, not just high-tech stuff. And so I think the critical challenge today is for us to fundamentally rethink how we prepare young people to be innovation ready.
You know that people like to call you controversial or provocative because you say things like what I'm about to quote you as having told Forbes magazine back in April of last year. Here's the quote. Today, knowledge is ubiquitous, constantly changing, growing exponentially. Today, knowledge is free. It's like air. It's like water. It's become a commodity. There's no competitive advantage today in knowing more than the person next to you. The world doesn't care what you know. What the world cares about is what you can do with what you know. Now, that's going to come as news to a lot of people who thought that what they knew was pretty important. The world really doesn't care what you know?
Well, I'm guilty as charged, of course. Here's the situation. Knowledge is not only ubiquitous and available on every internet-connected device, it's also changing constantly. So whatever you learned in virtually any field 3 or 5 years ago is rapidly out of date. So all of us have to be just-in-time learners. And that suggests to me that what's most important is learning the skill and the will, meaning the motivation, to learn continuously. Our schools still focus much too much on transmitting academic content that a student could look up in a nanosecond on the internet. So certainly content knowledge is important. I'm not suggesting otherwise. But if you think of it as a three-legged stool preparing all young people for the 21st century, there's content knowledge, there's the skill to use that content to acquire new content, and there's a number of skills I wrote about in my last book called The Global Achievement Gap. And then there's the will, the motivation to ask good questions, the curiosity, the persistence, the tenacity. Of those three things, I believe motivation is the most important and the one we frequently do the most damage to in our forms of schooling today.
Thus, your conclusion that it's more important to know the right questions to ask as opposed to having whatever trivia might be at your fingertips. Is that right?
Well, Steve, it isn't my conclusion. Actually, you know, for my last book, The Global Achievement Gap, I interviewed a wide variety of executives, literally from Apple to Unilever to leaders in the U.S. military. I interviewed college teachers, civic leaders, and I asked them, what are the skills that matter most today? Over and over again, I heard the importance of critical thinking, the importance of collaboration, the importance of initiative and entrepreneurialism, agility and adaptability, effective oral and written communication, accessing and analyzing information. And every single time, those employers said to me, you know, of course content knowledge is important, but it's changing all the time. I can teach them the content, they told me. But what I cannot teach them is how to ask a good question, how to learn continuously, how to work collaboratively, how to communicate effectively.
Well, we know that. I mean, I hear we've done many programs on those issues, and we know that that's what the workplace wants, and that's what business leaders want. And yet, for some reason, we seem to be pumping out graduates from colleges or universities or high schools that seem to have very poor communication skills. Why this disconnect?
Well, I think one of the core challenges is that we are not really clear about the outcomes that matter most, either from secondary or post-secondary. We continue to believe that school is mainly about acquiring more content knowledge. We underemphasize the importance of skills. And of course, far too many of our standardized tests are multiple choice factual recall tests. And with much more pressure on teachers to get students ready for those tests, they're cutting writing out of the curriculum, Steve. They're cutting oral presentations out of the curriculum. What gets tested is what gets taught. So we have a study, for example, a book called Academically Adrift that came out in this country a couple of years ago. And it points to the fact that 1/3 of all four-year college graduates in this country are no more able to think critically or communicate effectively than when they started college 4 years prior. So maybe they've sat in on lots of courses and acquired lots of content knowledge, maybe gone to some cool parties, but in fact, they're really not employable. And that's why we see large numbers of college graduates today either underemployed, having jobs that don't require a BA degree and certainly don't pay BA degree wages, or not employed at all.
Are you describing, in some respects, a permanent underclass as a result of this?
Well, I'm deeply concerned about two things. One is, of course, persistent poverty. We know that childhood poverty is the clearest predictor of underachievement in schools. And as we see a world that is increasingly bifurcated between the haves and the have-nots, we see increasing poverty. And more than that, less and less opportunity, because opportunity demands skill and demands education. But then the question becomes, what kind of education? What kinds of skills? And the problem that I see is that I'm a recovering high school English teacher myself. And most of us teach in the ways we've been taught. And most of us as parents, and I'm a parent as well, and even a grandparent, most of us as parents and grandparents want and assume schools should look like the ones we went to. So the challenge here is to fundamentally rethink, reimagine education in the 21st century. And I'd like to remind folks, this is not the first time we've had to rethink education. You know, Steve, 150 years ago, most people went to one-room schoolhouses. Well, we reinvented the one-room schoolhouse as we transitioned from a rural agrarian economy to an urban industrial society, and we created the factory model, assembly line, batch processing schools we still have a century later. Only we don't have an industrial economy anymore, Steve. We have an increasingly innovation-driven economy, demanding fundamentally different skills. And when you can look up anything on the internet, knowledge, as I've suggested, is more and more of just a mere commodity. It's not value added. You don't need a teacher anymore to acquire knowledge. You don't need to go to school anymore to acquire knowledge. Georgia Tech is about to offer a master's in computer science for $6,000 a year, and you never have to step on campus. In situations like this that are emerging, the question becomes, what is the value added of a school? What is the role of a teacher in the 21st century? What are the skills that matter most for all students to be innovation ready?
Well, and let's follow up on that, because in your research, you were looking for the patterns that would explain sort of the optimal conditions for individuals with a knack for innovation. What did you find?
Well, here's the thing that really disturbed me deeply, frankly. I interviewed a wide range of young people in their 20s who were creative problem solvers. That's my definition of innovation. Pretty simple. You can be a problem solver without creativity, no innovation. You can be very creative, unable to solve problems, no innovation. So these young people were creative problem solvers in science, engineering, technology, but also in the arts, also social entrepreneurs wanting to solve social problems. I then studied their ecosystem. By that I mean I interviewed all of their parents to see if I could discern patterns of parenting that made a difference. I then asked each one of them, was there a teacher who'd made a significant difference in their lives? And again, the response was yes, but only often one or two teachers, the range being from elementary all the way to graduate school. But when I interviewed those teachers, Steve, I made what was for me a stunning and troubling discovery. In every case, the teachers who had made the greatest difference in the lives of these young innovators were themselves outliers in their institutional settings, teaching in ways that were fundamentally different than their peers, yet remarkably similar to one another. Then I spent time visiting those schools that really do a very good job of teaching innovation. And it didn't take me long, because there aren't very many. But I'm talking about the brand new MIT Media Lab, the likewise very new Olin College of Engineering here on the East Coast. And on the West Coast, Stanford's D School, and then some high schools, High Tech High in San Diego, the New Tech High network around the country. And again, I found a remarkable pattern of teaching and learning, completely consistent with how my outlier teachers were teaching and consistent with one another. So what I've come to understand, Steve, is that the culture of schooling, as we continue to practice and perpetuate it, is fundamentally and radically at odds with a culture of learning that develops the capacity to be a creative problem solver. There are 5 fundamental contradictions, which I can go into if you like.
Well, let's, you've just painted a very distressing picture here, because if you're saying that a very tiny minority of teachers really foster that spirit of innovation, which you believe will be the key to achieving throughout the rest of this century, you're talking about a very tiny percentage of students actually having the skills to get through the rest of this century. What does that portend?
That's exactly the problem. The problem is most often young people become creative problem solvers in spite of their schooling, not because of it. You know, and even in very prestigious institutions like Harvard, Stanford, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, where I interviewed the teachers that students from there had told me had made the greatest difference in their lives, none of them had tenure, Steve, not one. Nor were they going to get tenure, because they were far more focused on teaching than on research, and they taught in very different ways. So here are the 5 contradictions for our audience to contemplate. Culture of schooling is all about individual achievement, rewarding, celebrating, measuring. Here's the problem. Innovation demands teamwork. It is, in fact, a team sport. Knowing this, the teachers whom I interviewed built accountable teamwork into every assignment and factored in assessment of teamwork and collaboration as much as individual achievement. Contradiction number 2, schooling is all about compartmentalizing knowledge. Math lives over there, very far away from science and humanities and so on, and rewards specialization. But the problem is innovation happens at the boundaries of academic disciplines, not within them, but at the corners around them. Judy Gilbert, director of Google, director of talent at Google, once said to me, what academics must realize is that problems cannot be understood nor solved within the bright lines of individual academic disciplines. But that's how we continue to teach. By contrast, these teachers of young innovators used a multidisciplinary problem or inquiry approach to all of their classes. Contradiction number 3, culture of schooling rewards passivity. You sit and you get. But by contrast, these teachers of young innovators put the emphasis on creating, not consuming knowledge, producing real products and services. And they saw themselves more as coaches than as experts at the front of the room. Contradictions 4 and 5, I think, are the most challenging of all. Contradiction number 4 is all about how we treat failure in school. It's a very bad thing. And we create, through that fear of failure, a culture of compliance and a certain kind of docility. But here's the problem. Innovation demands that you take risks, make mistakes, and learn from them. I went to IDEO, the most innovative design company in the world. They told me their company motto, Steve, is fail early and fail often. And when they explained that, in fact, there is no innovation without trial and error, it made total sense to me. Then I went to the D school at Stanford, and we were talking about the problem of grading, and one teacher said, you know, I'm really thinking F is the new A. You know, the whole idea being that the student who's taken a risk and maybe failed may have in fact learned more than the straight A student. And then finally, I went to the Olin College of Engineering, where I talked to a young woman who talked about the whole thing, you know, perceptions of grading and GPA. They don't even think about those as students at Olin. In fact, I just had dinner with a group from Olin College last week. And they said, you know, what we think about is iteration. How do we learn from one project or one course and apply what we've learned to the next project or course? It's a very different approach. Finally, most importantly, the issue of motivation. I said skill and will. Here's the will part. What I learned, Steve, is that these young innovators whom I profiled, whether they were from privilege or poverty, were far more motivated to make a difference than to make a lot of money. Indeed, I think that's more generally characteristic of many of the millennials. So then I went back and I said, what had these parents and teachers done to reinforce and stimulate the motivation many of us are born with? You know, we're born curious, creative, imaginative, though those qualities are schooled out of us. And I found another pattern, Steve. In every single case, both parents and teachers had reinforced 3 things: play, passion, and purpose. I can say a little more about how they did that if you like, but it was a very stunning discovery for me how much both these parents and teachers valued and supported intrinsic motivation with play, passion, and purpose.
There's so much to follow up on there. I almost don't know where to go, and we've only got a few minutes left here. But let me try this. Does it matter what motivates achievement? You pointed out it was the desire to break through as opposed to the desire to make a lot of money. If we need innovative people going forward, does it matter really what motivates them?
I think that's a great question. But if you look at the challenges that we face going forward, they are about sustainability, first and foremost. They are, I would argue, even about the survival of the species, ultimately, and the capacity of the planet to thrive. You look at whether it's healthcare, or whether it's education, or whether it's energy, or whether it's water. We have very fundamental challenges as a species. So to the extent that we are encouraging our young people to really want to make a difference in the world, I think matters greatly, Steve. And if you think about the larger fact that our economy so far in the US and in Canada is far too driven by consumption. Here in the US, it's nearly 3/4 of our gross national product, consumer spending. But if you raise a generation of young people who are more interested in creating than consuming, you've already begun to get ahead of this problem of sustainability, in my opinion. Now, sure, these kids still want to be, they want to earn a decent living, but it fascinates me how many of them don't want to buy a car. They'd rather use a zip car or a bike, don't necessarily even want to buy a house. They see themselves moving around. They don't need to be tied down. So it's a different world, Steve.
Okay. Let me try this. I can't figure out whether I should be completely depressed about the fact that the 5 contradictions, as you just laid them out, mean that we're doing everything wrong and need to make radical changes in order to make things right. And I ask myself, do we have the leadership? Do we have the conditions in place right now, in your country and in mine, for this massive rethink that you think we need to do in order to be successful? How would you answer that?
Well, I think you've asked exactly the right question. And I think there's good news and bad news here. The good news is we have a large number of schools who are innovating from the bottom up. They're not asking for permission. They're only asking for forgiveness, right? If somebody sort of raises a question or a concern. There are more than 500 schools affiliated with the Hewlett Foundation's Deeper Learning Initiative here in the US, including some schools that have an international perspective through the Asia Society. Likewise, we have a group called Ed Leader 21 here in this country, which is a group of more than 100 public school districts who are attempting to really think carefully about how do you teach what they call the 4 C's: critical thinking, collaboration, communication, and creativity. So we have a lot of innovation at the bottom up. What we lack, in my view, is an accountability system that incents teaching what matters most. Sadly, too many of our accountability systems put far too much emphasis on factual recall, on multiple choice tests, that the results of which tell us absolutely nothing about students being either work or citizenship ready in the 21st century. So the leadership we need educators and business leaders to work together to advocate an accountability system aligned with the outcomes that matter most. And that means not testing every kid every year as we do in this country, Steve. It's crazy. We're going to have to do selective auditing. We want to have every kid have a digital portfolio when they start school that follows them through school, where we see evidence in a body of work of growing mastery of the competencies that matter most. So it's not an impossible situation. There are wonderful schools all over the country, great teachers who are doing this work every day. The problem is creating an accountability system. I call it Accountability 2.0. That really is aligned with the outcomes that matter most, that incents much more powerful teaching and learning.
Tony Wagner, as always, you have given us a ton to think about, and for that we are grateful. Thanks for joining us on TVO tonight.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, Steve.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.